Hi friends! Okay, today I am going to give you a rundown on kind of the political and security scenario in Ecuador, which is fine. I know that the headlines can be very scary, but it is not scary at all. But I'm actually going to start this by couching it in some historical context going all the way back to medieval Spain. Because it turns out that has a direct effect even now. So, you had medieval Spain, which was a lot like medieval Europe everywhere else, where you had like fiefdoms and peasants and kings and whatnot. Very like King Arthur kind of ideals. And then you had the Moors, the Muslims, come conquer most of Spain and actually brought it very far forward, because for probably, I don't know, 300, 600 years, something like that, it was the Muslim kingdoms that were really pushing forward education and pushing forward all kinds of things. I think there might have, now take this with a grain of salt because I haven't deeply looked into it, but I think there might have even been like more women's rights in Muslim medieval countries than there were in European medieval countries. So anyway, you have those guys come in, but they were never really able to conquer some of the really deserty areas of Spain where it's not really worth investing a lot to conquer, because you can't really grow anything. It's like a very, very scrubby existence. And the people there, who were accustomed to having to like scratch out a living, were very hard to domesticate. So they kind of maintained their Spanish identity in contrast to the Moors, and even did not evolve their identity for a few hundred years, because no, this is who we are, we're not that. So after a while, enough of these little fiefdoms that hadn't been conquered ended up uniting and becoming powerful enough that as the Moors were, no longer building their civilization, but were kind of plateauing or getting a little lax, these fiefdoms were able to, as kind of a combined kingdom of Castile, were able to start fighting and getting some of their land back. And it was very much about religious identity. This is the period of Queen Isabella, who, paid for Columbus to go on his first trip and everything, and she was a princess from one of these Catholic regions who was out to re-Catholicize Spain, and was going to do it by destroying everyone else who wasn't Catholic, who wasn't from her Castellano identity. So she's the one who initiated the Spanish Inquisition, got permission from the Pope to torture and murder anyone who did not convert to Catholicism. And again, because they just kind of got stuck in this identity of whose here we are, in contrast to the progressive Muslims, they had maintained a medieval identity even hundreds of years later. So eventually you get to this point where they were able to become the world power, even though frankly they're really backwards, because they have all of this infinite wealth that they're extracting out of the new world. And all of the other royalty in Europe were apparently like, oh, the dirty cousin who has no manners, who is not sophisticated at all, but is so fucking rich. So they were like jealous of the dirty cousin. So yeah, they're kicking out and killing Moors and making people convert. They are now heavily invested in the New World, and yeah, that's right. And so they still have this like King Arthur kind of mentality, and just a very brutal mentality overall. But they had these stories, like kind of the leading form, from what I understand, of entertainment were these books that were published that were very much King Arthur kind of legends about these knights who go and battle Moors and who go into exotic lands and fight people who have ears so big that they can like wrap them around their body, and fantastical beasts, and they always vanquish their enemies, even though they're just like a handful of proud Castellano knights against armies of infidels. Uh, and So they discover this new world, and they discover that they are literally able, with just a handful of Castellano knights, to overcome armies of tens of thousands because of four things. Number one, the germ outbreak of smallpox and stuff like that that went before them. Like, they would come, they would see the place, they would go back to Spain to get permission to conquer it and to like recruit their people and to build up supplies, and then they'd get back like 4 years later, and the germs that got shared while they were there had now swept through the population, had decimated a notable part of the population, had taken out key rulers, and then that triggered civil war, specifically in this area. The king heard that there were weird ships and weird men seen. The king came down with a mysterious, horrible illness and died, and then his sons got into a civil war over the territory. And so the kingdom of Peru itself, or I should say the Incan kingdom, was in this state of weakness when these Spaniards come in. So the first one was the germs just kind of softening the enemy for them. Number two was that they had armor. The Incans did not have metal smelting the way that they had developed it in Europe. So they were not able to make anything that had that sharp of an edge and was that strong. And so there was simply no piercing the armor. Number three, the Spaniards had the swords. The Spaniards did have something that was that strong and that flexible and that sharp that it could go through their wooden shields and whatever. So they couldn't hurt the Spaniards. The Spaniards, with just like one swipe of their arm, could take off 3 heads. And then the Spaniards also had horses, which meant that they could move very quickly from one area to another. They could get out of a bad situation and like get around the back. So if you think our equivalent now would be if all of a sudden there were spaceships that came down, no matter what we shot at them, it could not get past their shields. They had these terrible lasers that could just cut through absolutely everything they have, and they could almost instantaneously just like buzz around wherever, however. Like, that's how scary and intimidating and unequal of a military setup this was. So you have these handfuls of very backward guys with very fucked up values who are now going to these other worlds this new world, where it is just like all these books they've been reading, because I forgot to mention this, they publish all these like fairy tale King Arthur legends in Spain, and they did not tell people that they were fiction. They were largely understood to actually be historical accounts. So these knights get to this new world and they're like, oh, we know exactly what to do. We've read this story our entire lives. And they just go about conquering the kingdoms. Like, it blows my mind that there ended up being an actual correlation between these fictional stories and the unprecedented opportunity they were provided with. So anyway, they come to the new world. Their single purpose is to extract its wealth and be lords over peasants. And this is one difference between the Anglo settlers in North America and the Latin settlers in Central and South America, is the Anglo settlers wanted to take the land and work it themselves, which is, that almost sounded like I'm justifying it. Not at all. But, so the Anglos just, genocided. Whereas the Latins came and enslaved. They were given by the king what were called encomiendas, or kind of commendations. I don't know the word in English, but they were basically given a geographic area and the right to extract whatever out of that area, including out of the people in it. So you were given like 20 villages and they are your slaves. And it is your God-given right to take everything that they have. So the Spaniards were the biggest pieces of shit who have ever lived on the planet. Like, one guy went to an area that was showing some level of like rebelliousness and killed 600 children. And that like maybe raised an eyebrow a little bit. Maybe like, that's like, okay, well, that's a next level. But no one condemned him. No one said it was wrong. And not to say that the Incans were like these great people. When there was that civil war between the two brothers, one of them, when he like got to the court, got access to all the people who were the court of his brothers, killed them all, hung them, and then even like the pregnant women cut the babies out of their stomachs and hung the dead babies from the dead mothers by their umbilical cords. So the Incan leaders could be just as heinous, but the difference was the Incan leaders had the motive of establishing stability. So they had storehouses throughout the whole entire empire that were filled with every supply you could possibly need. And if one area of the country was suffering because of famine or lack of water or whatever, then they got access to the resources that they needed to get through. So under the Incans, there was no more famine. There was very little suffering. And families were required to pay a tax of every family needed to send one man to work for 3 months to like maintain the roads, to fill the storehouses, to work the emperor's land that filled the storehouses. But that's like, was it 3 months or 4 months? I can't remember. But that's like 25 to 33% tax, but it's on one person of an entire household. So it's a lower tax level than, for example, most of us Americans are paying right now, but a much greater level of stability. Whereas the Spanish came in and just consumed the people, like brought this unbelievable level of, because basically they taxed everything that the people produced to the point that the people couldn't live themselves anymore. And that was like seen as righteous and good and, worthy of praise. So it should not come as a surprise that the upper crust of Latin America, who are the direct descendants of these Spaniards, who have this unprecedented sense of entitlement and very backward values about how you exist to support me, should not come as a surprise that they are corrupt as fuck. So, that they have no qualms about getting in with the cartels and cooperating with them because might is right, and the whole point is to have might so you can be right. And that they just feel this sense of entitlement to government funds. Like embezzling, we inherently as North Americans, like we know it's bad and might choose to do it anyway, whereas they don't even know it's bad. They're like, well, but this is my country. I am in charge of it. All that it has is mine. I'm just taking what's mine. Why are you putting your paws on it? So now let's talk about the exact situation in Ecuador. Now that we understand this, like really deep difference in the thought process in the upper crust. In Ecuador, like 5-6 years ago before the pandemic, Ecuador was considered one of the very safest countries in Latin America. It has been described in the past as the Switzerland of Latin America, just very centrist, leaning progressive, like leaning liberal, where they're they have, I think, the highest minimum wage of Latin America, and lots and lots of worker protection laws. Because of this really horrible predisposition to exploit. However, and they were quite stable. The country produces, because they have the Andes, they produce a ton of hydroelectric electricity. They also are an exporter of fruits and vegetables. They have huge amounts of fertile land. Lots of not only hydroelectric electricity, but just lots of clean water, tons of minerals, lots of gold, silver, that kind of stuff. So a very resource-rich country that had enough, not the greatest, like not what it could be, but had enough protections of its lower class to have pretty decent stability. But then the pandemic hit, and trade gets interrupted, and there aren't as many jobs, and it pinched Ecuador into this economic crisis. And there was all of a sudden, oh, and one other thing. Okay, so right before the pandemic, there's this president who, it's a whole interesting situation. I should go ahead and tell it. So, Correa is the most controversial public figure in the history of Ecuador, as far as I'm aware, because he became president and immediately started doing all of these public works projects. So he is the reason they have modern roads. He is the reason that the public bus system uses really nice Greyhound style buses rather than the really crappy ones where people are like bringing their chickens on and like you feel every single bump. Like he was the one who built the dams. He was the one who built the highways and all of this. He brought internet into the country. It's fiber optic to the curb throughout almost the whole entire country. That was all Correa. That was what he did during his first term. But there was a problem because they would have a project that should cost $10 million, but they would say it cost $80 million. And where do you think that other $70 million went? So he's got this popular support because he's helping people on every level of society. Like he's helping even the very poorest have access to better economic opportunities. And he's got massive support amongst the people who are helping with the execution of the projects because they are all taking the vast majority of the money. And are like raping the country financially while also helping the country. So he's really controversial. He has been, what's the term? Not condemned, but the court has found him guilty of incredible corruption. He should be serving life in prison, but he has political asylum in Belgium and will be there for the rest of his life. And from what few of his tweets I've read, he's very much like a Donald Trump narcissist, I'm right, everyone else is wrong kind of personality. So don't feel sorry for him. He became a billionaire by being president of the country. That's how fucked up he is. One of the things Correa did was the United States had a military base on an island off the coast of Ecuador, and Correa kicked that military base off. The role of the military base was to disrupt drug trafficking. So now you have, with the pandemic, this huge economic opening, or sorry, I should say much, much greater economic need, and no one keeping the drug traffickers from accessing the country. And so during the pandemic, they started building an organized crime network throughout the country in order to be able to do all the things that organized crime does, move product in the form of drugs, in the form of human trafficking, and also to begin extorting local businesses. Like, hey, we love your beef farm here. It would be really, really too bad if someone were to come in and kill all of your cows. You can pay us 40% of all of your income and we will protect you from having someone come in and kill all of your cows. And we actually have friends who are Venezuelan who are refugees here, and there's tons of racism against Venezuelans here. Their skin is too dark and they are fleeing their own economic issues, so they're seen as like spreading Venezuela's chaos as they kind of go throughout Latin America looking for more opportunity. So our Venezuelan friends all had these jobs of doing deliveries on their motorcycles, and our friends were approached by one of the local gangs for extortive purposes and had to stop working lest they bring violence upon themselves and the family. So it was getting absolutely everywhere. And so here you have the new president who just got elected in, who said his absolute number one priority was fighting organized crime, and who is like 35 years old. He's the youngest president in Ecuador's history. And basically, the big implication of this is he feels that he needs to prove himself, and he's more than happy to measure his dick against anyone else's. So he, after some gangs did he announced that they were going to do some El Salvador-style mega prisons which that's a whole nother thing I can talk about, which is really fascinating. But as soon as he announced that, and that some of the gang leaders who were in prison but still kind of able to function from within prison, he announced they were going to be moved. So then the gangs retaliated by like taking over a TV station and doing all these like kind of terrorist style acts of violence, which were really honestly like quite small scale. Like America's normal level of violence is much higher than what these terrorist acts were, but Ecuador was such a peaceful place before that no one could comprehend that this was happening to them. It felt like a war was breaking out. So the president last fall declared a state of exception and started exercising all these presidential powers to bypass the normal, what do you call that? Judicial process and just straight up throw people in prison. So they arrested, right now I think they're between 2,000 and 3,000 people who they had some reason to believe were associated with organized crime. And they are building the mega prison, and they killed a bunch of others who tried to fight back. And in a matter of weeks, Ecuador went from, there's a headless body in the river, my friends are getting extorted and their families might be attacked, and like very much it's low, back to like, nope, everything's tranquil. The gangs are hiding. The president showed that he was willing to act on their level. He was willing to meet violence with violence, and organized crime has been largely kicked out of the country. It is no longer touching the average citizen anymore. So you may have seen a bunch of headlines about Ecuador's incredible, crisis last fall, but it was a crisis that was dealt with very effectively. And there might be some people in jail who shouldn't be in jail, but frankly, kind of a small price to pay. Next thing, now this just happened. There's been this tit for tat going on between Ecuador and Mexico. So there's this new president who is, even though he is from one of those Spanish families, his family are the largest banana exporters, they're billionaires. And frankly, even though he's being beneficial to the country, he's probably also a prick. Just because of where he